Have you ever noticed how a single thought can ignite an entire storm inside you? One moment of desire, a spark of craving, and suddenly your mind is no longer your own. It races, it chases, it imagines, it grasps. It tells you, if only I had this, if only I could be there, if only life gave me more. This restless hunger is not new. It's not unique to you or me. It is the pulse of the human condition itself. From the time we open our eyes as infants, we are already reaching out for warmth, for comfort, for security. And as the years unfold, that reaching never stops. It simply changes its form. Toys become trophies, comfort becomes approval, survival becomes status. Craving is the thread woven through our existence, stitching together every joy, every disappointment, every restless night when we whisper to ourselves, "What's missing? What else do I need?" But here lies the paradox. Craving is both the engine of our progress and the weight of our suffering. Without it, humanity might never have built cities, discovered medicines, or created art. And yet with it, we find ourselves endlessly dissatisfied, trapped in cycles of want and regret. Craving promises fulfillment, but more often it delivers emptiness, leaving us thirstier than before. Think about it. How many times have you finally gotten what you wanted, only to feel the high fade quickly into the next desire? You save for the car, you buy it, you polish it, and then suddenly it isn't enough. A newer model, a shinier dream appears on the horizon. The craving never ends. It shifts, it disguises itself, it keeps whispering. Just one more step and you'll be happy. The Buddha called this endless thirst tanha, the craving that binds us to suffering. But this teaching isn't confined to ancient texts. You can feel its truth in your own daily life. From the craving of simple pleasures, that extra scroll on social media, that extra bite of dessert, to the deeper cravings of identity, to be respected, to be loved, to be seen. They all share the same pattern: the chase, the capture, the inevitable letdown. And here's the secret that most of us avoid. We don't crave the object itself. We crave the feeling we think it will give us. That's why craving is never satisfied for long, because feelings slip through our fingers the moment we try to hold them. What we truly want is not the thing, but the freedom, the peace, the wholeness we imagine lies behind it. This is where the journey begins. If craving is the starting point of our human struggle, then the question is not, how do I kill craving? For craving is part of being alive. The real question is, how do I live with it without becoming its prisoner? That is the essence of this exploration: craving, discipline, freedom, and the mind. Four forces intertwined, shaping the way we think, feel, and act. To understand them is to uncover a path, not to some distant enlightenment, but to a clarity that can transform how you live right now. So let us pause here at the gateway of this journey. Look honestly at your own life. Notice the cravings that have followed you like shadows, the ones you still chase, the ones that still keep you up at night. See them clearly, not with judgment but with curiosity, because once we recognize craving as the universal thread of the human condition, we can begin to ask the deeper questions. What role does discipline play? Where does freedom fit in? And how does the mind hold the key to it all? This is the story we're about to unfold. If craving is the shadow that follows us, then we must ask, what exactly is this force? Where does it come from and why does it feel so unshakable? At its core, craving is not an enemy. It is simply life expressed as movement. Your body craves food because it wants to live. Your mind craves connection because it longs to belong. Your spirit craves meaning because it cannot bear to feel empty. In its most innocent form, craving is survival itself, the pull that keeps us moving forward. But what begins as survival often mutates into something else. The same craving that pushes us to eat for nourishment becomes the craving that drives us to overindulge. The craving for love turns into a desperate grasp for validation. The craving for safety twists into a hunger for control. Slowly, craving ceases to serve us, and instead, we begin serving it. Have you ever noticed how craving doesn't knock politely? It invades. It takes over your thoughts, it colors your perception, it whispers into your ear at night. It convinces you that unless you satisfy it, you cannot rest. And yet, the moment you feed it, another craving is already waiting in line. Science today confirms what sages have long known. Deep inside the brain, dopamine circuits fire like sparks when we anticipate pleasure. But it isn't the reward itself that drives us most strongly. It's the anticipation, the chase, the promise of something just out of reach. That's why we scroll endlessly, binge without thinking, or chase success without ever stopping to ask, success for what? Craving is cunning because it dresses itself in many disguises. Sometimes it looks noble, the drive to achieve, to grow, to build a future. Other times it's more obvious, the itch for more comfort, more recognition, more pleasure. But beneath every disguise lies the same pattern, an endless search for completion outside ourselves. And here lies the great irony. Craving promises us wholeness, but it's built on the assumption that we are incomplete. It whispers that something is missing, and only by grasping can we fill the void. But the moment we reach out, the void grows deeper. The satisfaction fades, and we are left emptier than before. Think of it like drinking salt water in the desert. Each sip seems like relief, but it only makes the thirst more unbearable. That is the true nature of craving. It feeds on itself, multiplying the very hunger it claims to cure. But before we condemn craving, let's pause, because hidden in its very nature is a lesson. Craving shows us the shape of our longings. It reveals what we think will make us whole. If we can observe it without being consumed by it, craving becomes a teacher, pointing toward the parts of ourselves still yearning for peace. So perhaps the real question is not, how do I destroy craving? But rather, how do I see craving clearly without letting it rule me? For clarity is the first step toward mastery. And once we begin to see craving in its raw form, not as friend or enemy, but simply as energy, then we open the door to something else. A force equally powerful but far more liberating. A force that gives craving its necessary counterweight. That force is discipline. If craving is the restless wind that pulls us in every direction, then discipline is the anchor that steadies the ship. Without it, our lives are tossed endlessly by impulses, one moment chasing pleasure, the next fleeing discomfort. But with discipline, something remarkable happens. We begin to taste freedom. It may sound strange at first. How could discipline, which seems like restriction, actually make us free? Yet this is one of the greatest paradoxes of the spiritual path. Freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. That is slavery to impulse. True freedom is the ability to choose not to obey every desire, every craving, every flicker of thought that enters your mind. Think about something as simple as eating. Imagine you decide 3 meals a day, no snacks in between. At first, your body protests. Your mind screams. Hunger whispers, just one bite, just a little. But you wait, you hold your ground, and then a shift occurs. The hunger is still there, but it no longer controls you. You know you can wait. That knowing, that quiet strength, is freedom. Discipline is not punishment, it is training. Just as a musician practices scales or an athlete repeats drills, discipline trains the mind to hold its ground. It sharpens our ability to stay steady in the face of distraction, to endure discomfort without collapsing, to walk the path we have chosen instead of being dragged down whichever alley craving pulls us. The Shaolin tradition speaks of discipline not as harshness, but as structure, a rhythm that gives life direction. Wake at a certain hour, train at a certain hour, eat at a certain hour. When the body and mind fall into rhythm, the noise of craving softens. The mind discovers that it doesn't need to chase every impulse to survive. And yet, discipline is often misunderstood. Many imagine it as rigid, joyless, even cruel. But true discipline is not about suppressing life. It is about channeling it. Think of a river. Left unchecked, it floods the land, destroying everything in its path. But guided by banks, it flows with strength, nourishing fields, turning mills, sustaining life. Discipline is those riverbanks. It doesn't stop the water, it gives it direction. The Buddha himself spoke of the middle way, not indulgence, not self-torture, but balance. Discipline belongs here in the middle. Too little discipline and craving enslaves us. Too much, and life becomes brittle, joyless, mechanical. The art lies in finding the balance where discipline supports freedom instead of suffocating it. And here is something crucial. Discipline is not meant to last forever as a burden. It is a tool, a bridge. At first, you practice it consciously, resisting, restraining, struggling. But over time, it becomes natural. What was once effort becomes ease. The one who once battled against distraction now simply lives in alignment. It is in this alignment that craving begins to lose its power. For when the mind is trained, when the body follows rhythm, craving has less room to manipulate. Instead of being pulled around by hunger, desire, or fear, you become steady, not cold, not detached, but free to act from clarity rather than compulsion. And so, discipline is not the enemy of freedom, but its foundation. Without it, freedom collapses into chaos. With it, freedom blossoms into peace. Yet discipline alone is not enough. Because even with structure, even with rhythm, the mind has another trick: it scatters. It drags us into the past, into the future, into endless distraction. To walk deeper on this path, we must discover another key: the power of presence. Imagine this: a thought appears, I want that. A moment later, another, I don't like this. And just like that, the mind is already chasing or resisting, pushing or pulling. This is how most people live, carried endlessly by impulses they never chose. But what if freedom meant something greater? What if freedom meant the ability to live beyond impulse itself? This is where the path of discipline begins to blossom into something deeper. At first, we fight impulses with structure. We set rules, we draw lines, we hold ourselves back. But eventually we start to see. The real victory is not resisting impulses, but seeing through them. Think about the last time you acted purely on impulse. Maybe you snapped at someone in anger. Maybe you bought something you didn't need. Maybe you ate more than your body wanted. In the moment, it felt irresistible, but afterwards, there was regret, emptiness, a quiet knowing, that wasn't me at my best. Now, compare that to the moments when you paused, when you felt the impulse rising, the anger, the craving, the fear, and instead of obeying, you simply watched. The energy was there, but you didn't act it out. And then, like a wave breaking on the shore, the impulse passed. What remained was clarity, strength, freedom. This is the heart of freedom beyond impulse. It is not about killing desire or suppressing emotions. It is about no longer being owned by them. Impulses will still come because the body has needs, the mind has habits, life has challenges. But you will know, this is just a wave. I don't have to ride every wave. The Zen masters often compared the mind to a monkey leaping from branch to branch, restless and uncontrollable. But when you sit still, when you breathe, when you watch without grabbing, the monkey begins to tire. The leaps become fewer. And then one day you discover the monkey no longer rules you. You can simply be. And here lies a truth that changes everything. Every impulse has a lifespan. No matter how strong, it rises, peaks, and falls. The problem is not the impulse itself. The problem is our belief that we must obey it. Once we see this, a gap opens. In that gap, choice appears. And in that choice, freedom is born. Think of the greatest masters, the most serene elders, the most peaceful monks. Do you think they never feel desire, never feel irritation, never feel pain? Of course they do. But the difference is they are no longer prisoners of impulse. They see the wave, they bow to it, and they let it pass. This freedom is not coldness. It is not apathy. In fact, it is the opposite. It is the ability to engage with life fully, without being enslaved by every craving and fear. When you are no longer dragged by impulse, you can love more deeply because your love is not neediness. You can work with greater focus because your mind is not scattered. You can enjoy the world without being addicted to it. To live beyond impulse is to reclaim your life, to take back the steering wheel from the restless winds of desire. It is to move from reaction to response, from compulsion to clarity. And this is the essence of Buddhist wisdom. Not to escape life, but to live it with eyes open, with heart steady, with freedom that no craving can steal. But there is still a deeper step. Because even when we free ourselves from impulse, There remains one more layer, the self that clings to being free, the I that says, I am in control. To walk further, we must enter the mystery of the self itself. If impulses are waves, then the mind is the ocean where every battle takes place. This is where craving whispers, where discipline stands guard, and where freedom is either won or lost. It all happens here in the invisible theater of thought, emotion, and awareness. Think of the mind as a vast landscape. On one side, craving pulls you toward comfort, pleasure, and distraction. On the other, discipline urges you toward order, focus, and restraint. And between them, freedom waits, not as a referee, but as a hidden truth that both sides cannot yet see. But here's the problem. Most people never realize that their struggles are happening in the mind. They think the battle is outside, in money, relationships, possessions, status. They believe, if I just fix my job or find the right partner or buy the right thing, I'll finally be at peace. Yet even when they win those battles, the unrest inside continues, because the real war was never out there. It was always within. Picture this: you wake up in the morning and before your feet touch the floor, the mind is already at war. I should get up early and meditate, but I'm tired. I'll eat healthy today, but that pastry looks so good. I'll stay calm. But did you hear what she said yesterday? Every day this silent battle rages, and most of the time craving wins, not because it's stronger, but because we are unaware of the battleground itself. Discipline steps in as a warrior. It builds habits, it creates boundaries, it sharpens the blade of awareness. But discipline alone can feel harsh, even exhausting if it becomes a fight against yourself. True freedom is found when you realize you don't have to destroy craving, you only have to understand it. The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." This is not poetry, it is a direct instruction. If your mind is untrained, craving will drag you into suffering. If your mind is disciplined, craving loses its power. And if your mind is free, craving becomes nothing more than a ripple in the vastness of awareness. Imagine standing in a storm. The wind howls, the rain lashes your face, and you feel small, helpless, lost. This is how life feels when the mind is unguarded. Every impulse, every thought, every fear overwhelms you. But now imagine planting your feet firmly, breathing deeply, watching the storm without being swept away. The storm is still there, but your relationship to it has changed. This is the battleground of the mind, and this is where victory lies. Victory here is not about silencing all thoughts. It's not about becoming a blank slate. It's about learning to see thoughts as thoughts, impulses as impulses, emotions as passing weather. They may shout, they may seduce, they may threaten, but they cannot command you unless you surrender. This is why meditation is not just a practice, but a form of training for battle. Sitting quietly, breathing steadily, you are not escaping life, you are rehearsing for it. Each time a thought arises and you notice it without following, you are strengthening your inner warrior. Each time you watch craving rise and fall, you are winning without a sword. And over time, something remarkable happens. The battleground softens. The wars become fewer. The enemy you feared so much, craving, fear, restlessness, begins to lose its teeth. And in that quiet, in that stillness, you discover something profound. The mind was never meant to be a battlefield. It was meant to be a garden. But before the garden can bloom, we must face the illusions that fuel the war, especially the illusion of the self, the I that claims ownership of every thought and desire. To see through that illusion is to step into a freedom deeper than victory. We've seen how the mind can feel like a battleground, where craving and discipline wrestle for control. But what good is wisdom if it stays only in theory? To live freely, we need tools. We need practices that anchor us, strategies that help us not just in moments of peace, but in the chaos of real life. Self-mastery isn't about becoming perfect. It's about building habits that tilt the balance toward clarity, resilience, and inner freedom. So let's explore some practical ways you can begin to master the mind, not tomorrow, not someday, but today. First, the pause. This is the simplest yet most powerful weapon. Whenever you feel an impulse to shout, to scroll, to reach for that extra drink or sweet, pause. Just 3 seconds. Breathe. In that pause, you interrupt the automatic chain of craving. You remind yourself, I have a choice. The pause is not about suppressing desire. It's about reclaiming awareness before acting. Second, daily rituals. Structure tames chaos. Choose 1 or 2 rituals that anchor your day. Maybe it's 10 minutes of meditation in the morning. Maybe it's a walk after dinner. Maybe it's journaling before bed. These are not restrictions, they are footholds on the slippery slope of distraction. Over time, these rituals train the mind to return to balance, no matter what the day throws at you. Third, mindful substitution. The truth is, craving doesn't disappear, it transforms. So instead of trying to kill it, redirect it. When you crave junk food, reach for water or fruit first. When you feel the urge to scroll endlessly, step outside and take a breath of fresh air. You are not fighting against yourself, you are guiding your energy into healthier channels. Fourth, the power of reflection. Each evening, ask yourself, what choices today brought me closer to freedom? Which ones pulled me back into craving? Don't judge, don't shame yourself, just notice. Over time, this reflection becomes a compass showing you where your true strength lies. Fifth, environment design. The mind is shaped by what surrounds it. If you want peace, don't surround yourself with noise. If you want discipline, don't place temptations within reach. Remove triggers and you'll find that half the battle is already won. Remember, self-mastery isn't about willpower alone, it's about designing a life where willpower is needed less often. Sixth, compassion toward yourself. This one surprises many people. They think self-mastery means being harsh, punishing, unyielding, but the opposite is true. When you stumble, and you will, meet yourself with compassion. Each slip is not failure but feedback. Each misstep is a chance to practice again. Harshness breaks the spirit, compassion strengthens it. And finally, seventh, keep returning. This may be the most important of all. Self-mastery is not a finish line. It's not a mountain you climb once and declare victory. It is a daily practice of returning to awareness, to stillness, to discipline, to freedom. Some days will be easy, others will feel impossible. But every time you return, you carve a deeper path within yourself. Over time, these small strategies accumulate. The pauses grow longer. The rituals grow deeper. The cravings grow quieter. And one day, without even realizing it, you look back and see that the battlefield of the mind has begun to transform into a field of peace. But mastery doesn't mean control alone. It means learning to flow with life, to let go of the illusion that you must always fight, always win, always dominate. And that brings us to the next step, understanding the self, and why the self itself may be the greatest illusion of all. In the ancient world, craving was simple. Food, shelter, survival, a little comfort, a little power. But in our modern lives, craving has evolved into something far more subtle, far more seductive, and far more dangerous. Today, craving doesn't just knock on the door. It floods every corner of our existence, disguised as convenience, entertainment, even love. Look around you. The endless scroll of social media feeds, each post tugging at your attention, notifications buzzing as if every message is urgent, every update essential. Advertisements engineered to spark desire before you even know what you want. This is craving multiplied by technology, magnified by algorithms, and delivered directly into your pocket. And the truth is, we are hooked. Not because we are weak, but because the modern world is designed to keep us hooked. Entire industries thrive on your craving. Companies compete not for your money first, but for your attention. Because once they have your attention, they can shape your desires, your choices, even your sense of self. But craving in modern life doesn't stop at technology. It hides in the chase for success, the hunger for status, the pressure to always do more, be more, show more. The house, the car, the clothes, the perfect vacation photo. Each promise whispers, if you just have this, you'll finally feel whole. And yet, as soon as you get it, the high fades, and a new craving takes its place. Consider how rest has become a luxury, how silence feels uncomfortable, how even a moment of boredom is filled instantly with a screen, a song, a distraction. We have trained ourselves to believe that stillness is wasted, when in truth, stillness is the space where real freedom is born. Modern craving is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, almost noble. The craving to always help others, to be liked by everyone, to appear strong even when you're crumbling inside. These cravings are praised by society, but they still drain you, still chain you to expectations that may not be yours. So how do we navigate this storm? First, by seeing it clearly. By recognizing that craving today is not only about what we consume, but about what consumes us. Second, by remembering that technology, wealth, and success are not evil in themselves. They become traps only when we mistake them for fulfillment. Think of a smartphone. It can connect you with loved ones, teach you new skills, even guide you to moments of reflection. But in the same breath, it can enslave you, keep you restless, make you forget your own thoughts. The tool itself is neutral. The question is, do you own it or does it own you? The challenge of modern life is not to run away from society, but to live within it without being devoured by its cravings. To walk through the marketplace without losing yourself in the noise. To use technology without becoming used by it. And here lies the gift of ancient wisdom in a modern world. The teachings of discipline, awareness, and freedom are not outdated relics. They are more urgent than ever. Because if craving has grown louder, then our awareness must grow sharper. If distractions multiply, then our discipline must deepen. Only then can we stand in the middle of modern life, phones buzzing, ads flashing, demands piling up, and remain steady, awake, free. And yet, even as we face modern craving, there is another dimension we must not ignore. The emotional weight of craving, the way it twists our hearts, clouds our relationships, and burdens our spirit. To truly see craving, we must understand not just its outer forms, but its inner cost. When people hear the word discipline, they often imagine rigidity, strict schedules, rigid control, a life drained of spontaneity. And when they think of creativity, they imagine chaos, freedom without boundaries, wild inspiration flowing without order. But the truth is, discipline and creativity are not enemies. They are dance partners. And when they move together, something extraordinary emerges. Think of a musician. Without discipline, they cannot master their instrument. Hours of practice, scales repeated endlessly, fingers trained to move without hesitation. But without creativity, their music is lifeless, mechanical, empty, lacking soul. Discipline gives them the structure. Creativity breathes life into it. Together, they create art that touches the heart. Or picture a writer. Discipline forces them to sit at the desk every day, even when the words feel dry, even when the mind resists. But creativity gives those words color, rhythm, beauty. Without discipline, the book never gets written. Without creativity, the book isn't worth reading. This balance is not just for artists, it is for everyone. In modern life, discipline keeps us from drowning in distractions, while creativity helps us adapt, innovate, and find meaning in the routines we build. Discipline says, show up. Creativity says, make it alive. But here's the secret. True creativity does not come from chaos. It blossoms in spaces of focus. A painter cannot create with 10 windows of distraction open. A poet cannot hear their inner voice if the world is shouting too loudly. It is discipline, the habit of showing up, the practice of silence, the structure of ritual that clears the soil so creativity can bloom. And at the same time, creativity keeps discipline from becoming harsh. Too much discipline without creativity turns into perfectionism, self-punishment, burnout. Creativity reminds us to play, to experiment, to take risks, to laugh when things don't go as planned. It's like breathing. Discipline is the inhale, structured, intentional, steady. Creativity is the exhale, releasing, flowing, free. Neither can exist without the other. Together, they create the rhythm of a full life. So how do we nurture this interplay? Start small. Build a disciplined container, a time each day for practice, reflection, or work. Within that container, allow freedom. Paint badly. Write nonsense. Sing out of tune. The discipline is simply to show up. The creativity is to let go. Zen masters understood this deeply. The most disciplined monks who woke at dawn, followed rituals, sat in meditation for hours, were also the most spontaneous, the most alive. Why? Because their discipline gave them the ground to play without fear. Their minds were steady, so their creativity could flow without limit. When discipline and creativity come together, craving loses its grip. You are no longer chasing random pleasures to feel alive, because life itself becomes your canvas. Work becomes art. Silence becomes music. Even the smallest acts, cooking a meal, writing a note, sweeping a floor, become expressions of creativity shaped by discipline. And in this harmony, something shifts. Life is no longer about resisting or indulging impulses. It becomes about channeling them, transforming restless energy into creation, into beauty, into wisdom. This is the path of mastery, not just freedom from craving, but the ability to shape craving into something higher, to take the raw energy of desire and use discipline to sculpt it into meaning. But even mastery is not the final step, for beyond discipline and creativity lies something deeper, a peace that does not depend on structure or art or effort, a stillness that waits quietly at the center of it all. All along this journey, we've spoken of craving, discipline, freedom, and the ways they weave through our lives. But what does it mean to arrive at inner freedom? Not the fleeting sense of release after a victory, not the temporary calm when things go your way, but a freedom so steady that no storm can shake it. Inner freedom is not about escaping the world. It is not about hiding from temptation, or silencing every desire, or building walls around yourself. True inner freedom is discovered when you can walk through the noise, the cravings, the chaos of life, and remain untouched at the core. It begins with awareness. The awareness that every craving, every thought, every emotion is just a visitor, not your identity. The awareness that you don't need to obey every impulse, nor suppress it, but simply watch it come and go. When you no longer mistake these visitors for who you are, you take your first step toward freedom. Then comes acceptance. Freedom is not fighting reality, not wishing life were different. It is saying yes to what is here right now without resistance. Pain will come, loss will come, desire will come. But when you meet them with open hands instead of clenched fists, you discover that suffering does not control you anymore. And finally, there is letting go. Letting go of the illusion that freedom means control. Letting go of the idea that you must conquer the mind once and for all. Letting go of the self that clings, resists, and demands. This is not defeat, it is release. The same way a bird becomes free not by owning the sky, but by spreading its wings and letting the wind carry it. The paradox of inner freedom is this. It is not earned by striving harder, but by surrendering deeper. Discipline opens the door. Creativity lights the path. Awareness clears the way, but freedom itself arrives like a quiet dawn, unexpected, effortless, undeniable. Think of the masters of wisdom, the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, the sages who walked through war and famine with serenity in their eyes. They were not free because the world was kind to them. They were free because nothing in the world could chain their hearts. And this is possible for you too. Not someday, not in some distant monastery, but here in your daily life. In every pause before reacting. In every breath you take with awareness. In every moment you remember, I am more than this craving. I am more than this thought. I am already free. Towards inner freedom is not a path you walk once. It is a journey you return to every day until one day you no longer feel like you are chasing freedom at all. You simply realize it has always been here, quietly waiting within you. And with that realization, the restless search ends. What remains is peace. What remains is clarity. What remains is freedom. As we reach the conclusion of this journey, it is worth pausing to reflect on the path we have walked together. We began with the recognition that human beings are profoundly shaped by craving, the restless energy that drives us toward pleasure, possessions, recognition, or fleeting distractions. Yet we have seen that craving itself is not inherently evil. It is simply a force, like fire. It can destroy when left unchecked. but it can also provide warmth and light when understood and channeled skillfully. Throughout the chapters, we explored how discipline emerges as the natural counterbalance to craving. Discipline is not repression, nor is it joyless rigidity. It is the art of aligning our actions with our deeper values, of creating the conditions where freedom can flourish. When craving pulls us toward impulse and dissatisfaction, discipline acts as the steady hand that guides us back to center. From there, we saw that freedom itself is not simply the license to indulge every desire, but rather the ability to act without being enslaved by desire. True freedom arises when we are no longer dictated to by every passing impulse. Instead, the mind becomes spacious, grounded, and able to choose wisely. The battleground for this freedom lies within the mind itself, for it is there that thoughts, feelings, cravings, and clarity intermingle. But recognizing the battleground is only the beginning. We equipped ourselves with practical strategies, mindfulness, meditation, reframing, moderation, the cultivation of wholesome habits. These are not abstract ideals, but living tools we can apply in daily life, from resisting the lure of endless consumption to navigating emotional storms with wisdom. In looking at modern life, we recognized how craving has taken on sophisticated new forms. In a consumer-driven world, craving is not only tolerated but engineered and amplified through advertising, digital technology, and social media. The challenge of self-mastery today is not less than it was in the Buddha's time. If anything, it is magnified. And yet, the same timeless principles apply. Awareness, discipline, and compassion remain our anchors in the whirlwind. We also considered the subtle dance between discipline and creativity. A life of pure rigidity suffocates, while a life of pure indulgence collapses into chaos. The art lies in balance, structuring our days with enough discipline to foster clarity and purpose, while allowing freedom and spontaneity to nourish imagination and joy. Discipline creates the container. Creativity fills it with beauty. Ultimately, all of this points toward inner freedom, the freedom that comes not from having every craving fulfilled, but from no longer being enslaved by craving. This is the quiet strength of the awakened mind, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a joy that does not wither when pleasures fade, and a clarity that sees life as it is, free from the distortions of grasping. The Buddha described the path as one of gradual training, from restraint to clarity, from clarity to wisdom, from wisdom to liberation. Our journey here has mirrored that rhythm. It is not about perfection, nor about suppressing all desire forever. It is about learning to live with awareness, to choose consciously, and to recognize that the deepest happiness lies not in chasing after every want, but in realizing the sufficiency of this present moment. So as you step away from these pages, the question remains, how will you live differently now? Will you allow craving to continue dictating your days, pulling you from one distraction to the next? Or will you cultivate the discipline and awareness that lead to freedom? The choice is yours. And in every small act of mindfulness, in every pause before impulse, in every breath taken with awareness, you are already walking the path toward liberation. This is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a life lived with clarity, balance, and inner peace. If these reflections resonated with you, I invite you to take this journey further. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more timeless teachings, mindful practices, and gentle reminders to live with clarity and peace. Each week, we share new insights to help you cultivate balance, freedom, and inner joy. Thank you for walking this path with me today. May your mind be steady, your heart be open, and may you always find wisdom in the present moment.